Is this live? So I'm Arti Rai. I am a law professor here at Duke Law School who works on intellectual property issues. And so I'm particularly delighted to be in the position to introduce one of the foremost thinkers about the economic analysis of intellectual property, in particular patent law. And that is Robert Hunt, a senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. I've known Bob for, 7 or 8 years now. I met him when I was previously at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the person who, nobody at the University of Pennsylvania knew people outside their school, so he brought us all together, the innovation people all together, the Wharton people with the law school people, and he has that great ability to not only do great work, but also to bring people together from different schools and help us all talk to each other. So even though he's an economist, he can really talk well to lawyers. He has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, which he received in 1996. And at the Federal Reserve, one might think that as a Federal Reserve economist, he'd have to focus on a lot of things that had nothing to do with intellectual property, but as far as I can tell, he writes at least as much as any professor who works in this area, so obviously they give him a lot of time to, or at least he makes the time to work in this area. And one of the interesting areas of intersection between his work in intellectual property and the work of the Federal Reserve is in the area of financial service patents, and Bob has written about that. But he's also written much more generally and has had a really significant impact with some of his articles on, in particular, on software patenting. His work on software patenting suggesting that patents are likely actually to perhaps at least reduce levels of R&D at firms that seek lots of those patents, was tremendously influential in the decision of the European Union ultimately to reject the software patent directive, which would have basically created a software regime, patent regime in the EU very similar to the one in the US. He has also written quite a bit about industry structure and innovation and patents. And today he is here to talk to us about his most recent work on the geography of innovation, specifically a tale of 280 cities. And that work is forthcoming in the Journal of Urban Economics. He has also published in the American Economic Review, in the Journal of Economics and Management Strategy, and the Journal of Industrial Economics. And he's a reviewer for many of those journals as well. So without further ado, I'm delighted to have Bob Hunt present his talk.
Thank you very much for having me, and Arti for those very kind words. I always have to start my talks with a disclaimer: these are my views and not those of my employers. This is joint work with two of my colleagues at the bank, Jerry Carlino and Satyajit Chatterjee. And actually, we're working on 4 papers on what we would call the geography of innovation. And I'm going to present results from 2 of those papers. We've actually got 3 of them written down, and the 4th one we're getting started to write right now. I don't know if we have anybody from Duke Economics here, but Christy Bazard is the RA on this project, and she's applying to grad school. You really should take her. She's excellent. So that would be my advertisement there. So it's always good to start off by asking, why do we care about what we're looking at here? And I would argue that most modern growth theory, that is the theories that economists write down to explain why it is that economies continue to grow over time, focus on what we call our knowledge spillovers. In other words, information that makes us all more productive, but we don't necessarily individually contribute to the production of that information. And as Bob Lucas pointed out, if knowledge spillovers are the key ingredient for this protracted economic growth, the place to look for it are in cities, because in some sense, cities are built to capitalize on knowledge spillovers. Now, Bob Lucas is a very smart guy, but in fact, Alfred Marshall was making exactly this point over 100 years ago. And it is true that if you're willing to accept all of the caveats you have to use patents as an indicator of innovative output, it is true that almost all patenting that goes on in the United States is going to inventors that live in urban areas. That is, using their home address to locate these patents, you find that 92% of them are people that live in cities. Another important part of the story is that we know that knowledge spillovers are local in character. Now that's kind of surprising in an era with the internet and with a heck of a lot of national and international trade in goods and services, but it's still the case that in fact these spillovers tend to dissipate with distance very quickly. And so we have this very important paper by Adam Jaffe where he studies the citation pattern in patents, and after you control for all of the things that you need to control for to do that well, what he finds is that a patent in a given city is 5 or 10 times more likely to cite another patent in the same city than a patent in a different city. Okay? And it's not just in the production of knowledge, but it's also in the productivity, the output that knowledge creates. So, for example, this important paper by Rosenthal and Strange tells you that, in fact, these productivity spillovers are extremely localized. They're down to the zip code level when you look at manufacturing firms. Okay? And this raises an important question. Well, what's the exact mechanism? Okay? Now, why is that important? Well, because different mechanisms have different policy implications. And governments are always thinking about ways of facilitating economic growth. It's very important that we understand what mechanism is operating so we know what the relevant policy levers are. Now, what we argue in this line of research is that a very important ingredient in the story is what we call the efficient matching of workers in firms. That is, if you want to have productive firms, and in fact, if you want to have productive researchers, it matters what researchers you put together. How do you organize that production? And our evidence for this argument is a very strong correlation between what I'm going to call inventive productivity, that is patents per capita, and job density, that is the number of jobs that you have per square mile in a city. Okay? Now, I'm actually an applied theorist by training, so we have a theoretical argument that's going to motivate the statistical analysis I'm going to describe to you. But I'm going to set the theory aside for the moment because I think the data itself tells such a compelling story that I don't need to introduce that now. I can let the data present the facts. But keep in your mind that the kind of analysis that we did is motivated by a theory. So we're not just fishing here. We had a particular idea and technique in mind to generate the facts I'm about to describe to you. Well, what are we going to do? We assemble a data set of U.S. patent data from the last 30-some years. We locate all of those patents by the address of the first inventor on the patent or the second inventor on the patent. It does not matter. And we locate these across the country. All right? And what we can show you is that we can locate 96% of those patents, which is pretty good. And then what we're going to do is try to explain that spatial distribution of patents. And in fact, we're pretty good at it. We can explain more than 3/4 of this spatial distribution of patents. The key variables that I want you to focus on today, these are the variables that economists tend to focus on when they think about inventive productivity. The first is scale. Okay? Most of the sort of standard literature here has the kind of view that bigger cities are better at innovating. And you could tell all sorts of stories. A very common story is that when you have a big city, then you have firms that are buying inputs from other firms in the city, and those sellers of inputs can afford to be more specialized. So in some sense, they make better inputs because they have bigger markets for those inputs, and that creates sort of an increasing return to scale. That's sort of the standard story you're going to get from economists. That's not the story I want to tell you here. Instead, what we're going to focus on is the role of density. Again, jobs per square mile. And I'm going to explain why that's an important and distinct phenomenon in a little bit. I'm not going to go into technique very much today, but you should know that we have lots and lots and lots of carefully constructed controls, all of the kinds of things that you should want to have in an analysis like this. And then we use all sorts of different techniques to deal with a variety of statistical and econometric problems that you might get in this analysis. I'm just going to set all of that aside, and if you want to study those issues, go ahead and read the paper, and I hope we do a fairly good job of explaining that. Things that are important to control for, and these seem obvious, are the local historical mix of industries and technology. Also local R&D inputs, okay? It's actually pretty easy to measure, for example, local human capital. You look at the education of people in cities. And it's pretty easy to locate academic R&D. The data is available. The tough part is the private R&D. And I'll describe that in a minute. But that was a lot of hard work that Christie and others did. And then, as I say, we do all sorts of tests for robustness. Here's the underlying data. This is patents per capita across our data set. Okay, all the way on the bottom is Little McAllen, Texas, whose rate is 0.07 per 10,000. And all the way at the top is San Jose. That's no big surprise, the home of the semiconductor industry, roughly 17 per 10,000. This is over the 1990s. That's not really surprising. So the variation is more than 2 orders of magnitude, nearly 3 orders of magnitude. You'll notice that near the bottom, these cities tend to be smaller. Near the top, these are bigger cities. So size certainly plays a role in this. But you can look at these cities and say, sort of historically, these are cities where certain manufacturing industries were very important. Rochester, New York, Trenton, New Jersey, Wilmington, Delaware. In any sort of economic history of invention and manufacturing, cities like that are going to show up. Where's Raleigh-Durham in here? Right about here. If you can rank order these guys, there's 280 cities. Raleigh-Durham is number 16. So in the top 6 percentile in patents per capita. You guys are doing just fine. And you're not surprised by that at all. Okay? Now, if you only take one idea away from this talk, the next slide is it. Okay? On the x-axis here, we have our measure of job density. On the y-axis, we have our measure of the log of patents per capita. Okay? And then we've just plotted the data. What does the plot tell you? Well, there's a modest correlation between the density of cities and their inventive productivity. That correlation is about 0.4. Okay? And the whole rest of the paper is about being more rigorous, controlling for all of the things that you ought to control for, how much of this correlation remains. And if it does, what explains that correlation? Okay? So here are the main findings. When you do this more carefully, in fact, you do find that inventions per capita rise with job density. Okay? That's after controlling for a host of other factors that you ought to control for. And this is important. It's a distinct effect from scale economies. Okay? So it's not just that big cities are good at this. Dense cities are good at this as well. Now, the only numbers I'm going to present to you today, I'm going to present our elasticities. Okay? What is an elasticity? It means that if I increase the number of jobs per square mile by 10%, for example, I'm going to increase the patenting per capita, in this case, by 2%. That's what the 0.2 means. Okay? So it's a nice way of getting a sense of the importance of these variables that I'm going to describe. Okay? Well, how important is an elasticity of 0.2? Well, it's at least as important as the elasticity of scale. So all of the economists that have been focusing on scale economies in the literature and argue that it's important, well, density is at least as important, and it's a separate effect. Okay? There's also a lot of variation in the density of cities across the U.S. And so, in fact, if you look at the top of the distribution, the most dense cities are patenting at a rate that's twice as high as the least dense cities. So this is economically significant. Okay? Other things we learn, there are threshold effects. For size, city size, this is total number of jobs, the threshold effect is pretty darn small. You just need to be a city of 60,000, and then scale is going to matter. Okay? What's interesting is for density, the threshold effect is pretty big, okay? 1,600 jobs per square mile. So half of the cities in our data are not that dense, and density doesn't matter at all for them, okay? All of the action is in the top half of the distribution of cities in terms of density. That's kind of interesting in itself. There are also diminishing returns, and this is new to the literature, okay? So ordinarily you would think, well, if the literature's right, it should be New York and Los Angeles that are the most productive in terms of inventing. It turns out that's not true. In fact, the returns to scale diminish pretty quickly so that the optimal city size is about 500,000 jobs. In terms of population, that's 750,000. That's what Austin and Raleigh-Durham were in 1990. Okay, so again, Raleigh-Durham looks pretty good. In terms of density, there's also an optimal density. So there's diminishing returns in density, but these tail off very slowly. So the optimal density is actually quite high, 2,200 jobs per square mile. Only 25% of cities in our data are at least that dense. And we're talking about a density that's something like Baltimore and Philadelphia. Okay, so again, scale and density are distinct. They have different threshold effects. And they have their diminishing returns set in at a different point in the distribution of cities. Now, what you might ask, well, why is it that we're looking at all workers? Not all workers are inventors, or certainly they're not all research workers. That seems like maybe the wrong measure. So we can redo the analysis and just focus on scientists and engineers, for example. And we learn two things when we do that. First of all, we get almost the same coefficients. So it doesn't matter whether we look at scientists and engineers or total employees. We're going to get similar measures. The other interesting thing, though, is if you focus on scientists and engineers, this diminishing return to density occurs only way out in the distribution of cities. Basically, you need to be in the top 10% of cities in terms of density before you're hitting the point of optimality. Okay? Another point, and I should make this point earlier because this is actually the most important variable in our analysis. Local human capital is the thing that explains inventive productivity. Okay? And in our data, what we're using is the share of the population that is over age 25 that has a college degree or more. You could use other measures, it won't matter, but that's a nice measure to get. Again, we have an elasticity here, it's 0.9. So in other words, if I increase the share of the population with a college degree by 10%, I will increase the rate of patenting per capita by 9%. That's a huge number. Okay? Everything else I'm going to say is taking into account this effect here. So the big mover is human capital. The next issue is, well, what about local R&D inputs? They have to matter, and it turns out they do matter. But the elasticities are pretty small. That is, after controlling for how well educated your local workforce is, having more R&D helps. But in fact, the increments are not very big. Okay? Now, as I say, it's pretty easy to get data on science and engineering, and you can actually cut that data finely. You can allocate it by city. We do this in intensity, so we're actually looking at sort of the R&D intensity of universities in our data. Similarly, we're looking at the R&D intensity of government labs. And then this is the variable we had to construct by hand. We located 1,800 private R&D facilities across the country at 2 points in time. And we calculate an intensity that is basically the number of labs divided by the number of private establishments that are in cities. All of these things matter, but it's kind of surprising how small the elasticity is. We didn't find a college town effect. You can have lots of colleges, but after you're controlling for local human capital, it won't matter. It doesn't matter if you have a very high share of the local population that's currently in college, as long as you're controlling for local human capital. And wait, there's more findings. This one we also didn't anticipate. The structure of local labor markets is extremely important. And this is another one of these puzzlers. You're thinking of firms that compete in a national and international context. Why does the local market structure matter? And you think about it for a while, and you realize, well, this is where they're buying their inputs. In particular, this is where they're hiring their labor. And so in terms of the costs and the productivity of the workers that you obtain, this could matter. And we construct a very simple measure. Essentially, we're calculating the average size of businesses. And we find that the average size of businesses is inversely correlated with patents per capita, and is a very big elasticity. Okay, well, what does this mean? This means that if you have a city whose firms are on average smaller, they invent more. Now you can tell two stories about that. One is a static story, that you have more local competition for labor, and this is good for workers. And if it's good for workers, they have better incentives to innovate. That's one story. The other story is dynamic. It says if your firms are smaller, they're probably younger. In other words, they're startup firms, and these startup firms are more innovative. We're not sure which of these is true. We need more research to tell. Next point is the historical mix of industries is very important. The elasticities here are pretty big. And these don't seem so surprising. If you've got cities with a large manufacturing sector, they're going to obtain more patents. Now this is both a function of two things. One is that manufacturing tends to use the patent system more than other sectors, and also manufacturing firms tend to be innovative. It's a combination of the two. Similarly, if you've got cities with a concentration in high tech, you're going to observe more patenting. If you have cities with large government sectors, state and local government in particular, you're going to see less patenting. This actually works against Philly, because Philadelphia has a very large local government sector. The historical mix of local technologies matter. In other words, if I have cities that have historically obtained lots of patents in chemicals and computers or electrical and mechanical equipment, you're going to observe them obtaining lots of patents in the future as well. Okay? Now here's an interesting question. In fact, Wes Cohen raised this to me originally a long time ago. Are we measuring inventive output, or are we measuring the choice that firms make and how they protect their inventions? Right? So here's a story that I've got, some cities are dense and some cities are not dense. I might like to use trade secrets, but in fact in dense labor markets it might be harder to protect my inventions using trade secrets. So instead I file for more patents. And could that explain what we're finding in the data? So given that Wes suggested this question, we went to his own data to try to see what the answer was. What we do is we use indices from his Carnegie Mellon survey that he and his colleagues wrote up in 2000. And by industry, they have measures of the efficacy of trade secret protection. And then we can construct an index for cities that basically is weighting by industry by using the mix of R&D labs, the industry mix of R&D labs in those cities, so we get a city-specific measure of the importance of trade secret protection. We can put that in our analysis, and we find two things. First of all, it doesn't affect any of the other results I've told you about before. So what we're measuring we think is real. Secondly, using the sign of the coefficients, it looks like patents and trade secrets are actually complements rather than substitutes. There's other evidence in the literature that suggests that that's true, and in fact even Wes's paper suggests that this is probably true. So it's not so surprising. But at the end of the day, we think we're measuring something that's real. Now I'm going to jump to the theory side that might explain why density is important. And what we do is generalize somebody else's model, a very nice paper by Berliant, Reed, and Wang. And here are the key ingredients. Workers are going to be different. They know different things. In order to produce and to invent, workers have to form teams, in other words, companies. Workers are going to do that in cities. That's where they're going to search for their potential partners. And the key point here is that the productivity of these firms that they form depends on the quality of the matches. In other words, if I know something, there's going to be an ideal partner out here for me to match with. And if I match with that partner, that's going to be the most productive business I can run. Okay? And then the question for me is, how long is it worth it for me to look for that ideal partner? And how do I make that calculation? Well, I have a partner in front of me who may not be my ideal, but may be fairly good. Well, how much time is it going to take for me to find somebody better, and how much additional income am I going to earn if I do find that person? That's the opportunity cost of searching for a better match. Okay? Well, what are the implications? Well, this is a model of the US, so firms and workers get to locate where they want. And they're going to do this based on the calculation of private benefits and private costs. So workers are going to choose where to live, and they're going to do that based on their expectation of how they do in the labor market. And of course, firms are going to respond and locate depending on the mix of workers that are locating in these cities. The size and density of cities, therefore, is going to be determined by these kinds of things. First and foremost, the efficiency of the matching process. In other words, how long does it take for me to meet with other workers to determine their type and therefore to determine whether they're a good person for me to match with, okay? And that arrival rate is going to be increasing in density. You bounce into people more frequently the more people there are. So there are increasing returns that is associated with density. But there are a lot of other factors. For example, the stability of matches. Do you have firms that fail a lot or not? The patience of workers, which determines how long they're willing to search. Access to local inputs, because having these kinds of things determine the productivity of all workers, independent of who you match with. And then things like local amenities and public goods, which may determine where I want to live. And of course, the taxes that you have to pay in order to fund those amenities as well. At the end of the day, what you find is that more dense cities are going to invent more per capita, okay? And it's kind of funny how this works. In more dense cities, workers are more selective. They're pickier about who they match with, okay? Why are they pickier? Because their opportunity cost is lower, not higher. Why is it lower? Because even though you're being pickier, on average it takes you less time to find a match, okay? And that's the increasing returns associated with density. Productivity is higher for two reasons then. First of all, because the average match is of higher quality. That's the intensive margin. And also because workers are spending more time inventing. They're working in teams rather than searching for the matches. And so there's also a benefit on the extensive margin. Okay? And this is a distinct argument from economies of scale, which argues that large cities are more productive. We're showing that dense cities are separately more productive. And so this rationalizes what we saw in the data earlier. Let me talk briefly about policy implications. I wind up presenting this paper a lot in Europe. And the reason is that there's a technology policy community there that likes the idea of building technology clusters. It's as if you could pass a law and build a technology cluster. That's the way they think about it, okay? And the point that I make when I'm in these conversations is that what really matters is the efficiency of the labor market. It's the interaction of workers and firms. And at least in the US, this is an endogenous thing. This is not something you legislate. This is something that private markets sort out. Okay? It's highly unlikely that you're going to generate clusters from central planning. There are probably examples you could give me, but I think there are many examples where you try to legislate something like this and it doesn't work. In the US, go back 15 years and think about this debate about industrial policy. So there was a time where we were asking whether the government was better at allocating resources across different industries than was the private sector, or for that matter, allocating workers to different industries or even to different cities. In fact, does the government know better than individuals what cities they should be living in and what firms they should be working for? And I think the consensus, at least in the US, was this was a bad idea. Another important point is that there's very significant path dependence. And there's plenty of evidence in what I've already shown you. This historical mix of industries and technologies, what was important in the past continues to be important in the future. So that if you can get a cluster started and it reaches sufficient scale, that cluster is going to be self-perpetuating. And Raleigh-Durham is probably a pretty good example of that. The tricky part is getting it started, right? Some of it's luck. A lot of it has to do with the quality of these very important matches between workers and firms. And anybody who works in a department, an academic department, understands this. The productivity and the reputation of the department depends on the kinds of colleagues that you recruit. I don't think many of us would agree with the idea that you can do that well with a central plan. This is something that departments have to do in their own way, and it's not easy. But to think that you can assemble a department by dictate generally does not work. Okay, so that's the end of my remarks. If you guys have questions, I'm happy to take them.
I will do the honors of calling on people, but before I do that, I have one question, which relates back to some of your earlier work, in which you suggest that patents are a substitute for R&D for industry complements. But here you're using patents as your output measure of innovation. So how do you reconcile using patents as your main output measure of innovation with your earlier work suggesting that patents are a substitute for innovation?
Well, there's 2 points there. One is that in the, Artie's referring to the paper on software patents. The general view, or if you write down a careful model, in most states of the world, patents are going to facilitate R&D. It's a special set of circumstances in which patents can become a substitute for R&D. And essentially, it's an environment in which the patent system's not performing well. So you need to have an R&D intensive industry. You need to have intellectual property being granted in a way that's very loosely related to the inventions that are actually going on. And then you need to have a lot of technological overlap. And if these things are very pronounced, then you can have this negative correlation between patenting and R&D. But I would say that's the exception. And we do find some evidence of that for software patenting, but it's not among software firms, it's among a small group of manufacturing firms, typically computers and electronics, that have really concentrated on software patents. And so this may be the one instance in which the patent system's not operating particularly well. So the first answer is that's a special case. The second point is the way we construct this data set. What we're not saying, I mean, you just think about different technologies. In some industries, one patent encompasses an entire product, a chemical. And in other industries, to get to a product, you have 100 patents. Right? And so it's very, if we're going to sort of avoid a measurement problem, we have to do this in a coarse way. So what we do is we measure patents obtained over a decade. So there's this overall rise in patent propensity going on. That won't matter when we just add it all together. And then the other point is knowing that there's a lot of variation in this behavior across industries and technologies, you have to have controls for that on the right-hand side. And so we carefully construct controls that should soak up a lot of that. But I would never argue that patents are a perfect measure of innovative activity, but I think if you're careful, it's a good measure.
Great. Jerry.
Terrific. Just wonderful questions that you're asking and a wonderful contribution that you're making. I had 2 comments and 1 question. On the technological overlap, and that kind of relates also to this question of trade secrets. We had 2 important areas, the Silicon Valley area and the Treviso area in North Italy, which is the hub of about everything that happened in Italian design, for both functional and aesthetic, for about 30 years. You had basically very little trade secret, and you had an enormous amount of know-how spillover. In the Italian area, it was done through the Chamber of Commerce, where these people were actually meeting all the time and openly exchanging their stuff. And in Silicon Valley, you didn't have, you couldn't keep the employee from transfer. You couldn't have restrictive agreements, and they just transferred. So the know-how was like a constant Chamber of Commerce. So I think the importance there in looking, it's hard to pick up in your data the way West Coney have gone about it. The question is not trade secret, but how much know-how is being shared with or despite trade secret. That's the real value. Second, I think you have to be careful about your conclusion about centrally planned, because first of all, this word industrial policy has a horrible reputation, and I can see why by the way you define it. But not everybody I don't know anybody who defines it that way. So if you look at RDU was centrally planned in the sense that there was a governor, and he became a big player here at Duke, and he saw the opportunity and laid the public good side of it, and then it caught on and it developed. But it would never have happened without Terry Sanford. And if you're looking at the German, I don't think there's rigid, I mean, there may be sometimes, but you have now this German foundation for research. So if they find a place where a cluster seems likely on your other things, they can put up $500 million like that and direct it to the right people. So I'm not so pessimistic there.
Well, actually, I think we're saying the same thing. You had a governor that made an environment that was very conducive for the development of Raleigh-Durham. But what made Raleigh, and of course there was a fair amount of R&D money that came from Washington that helped it.
And the three universities.
But what made Raleigh-Durham survive and prosper, unlike, for example, similar experiments in Pennsylvania, where they tried to do it, is the quality of workers and firms that got together down here.
Right.
So, at the end of the day, what's going to make this work?
You can't substitute for that. But
That's right.
The idea of the research triangle was essentially.
Yes.
So I think a private public. I think it can be done by private-public partnership. That's my thesis.
Well, the key is there are failures of the private market
Yeah, and
that
failures of the
where
public
government
market.
action
That's
is appropriate,
That's right.
and then there are areas where the private market is better, and it's very important to know the difference between the
think that's
two,
right.
and that's really the point I'm trying to make.
My question was about the Washington area. How did you map the Washington area? Because
Do you mean Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, because you've got all that stuff to sprawl into Virginia. It goes out, and there's lots of other cities that may actually be claiming credit for inventive capacity in that entire area, but the generator is Washington.
Well, for that particular city, our definition of the city does include the counties in Maryland and Virginia, the contiguous counties. But more generally, your question is very important because cities change, their definition of cities change, and so we lock that definition down as it was 20-some years ago for this very reason.
Let's see, Bob?
I was going to ask how comfortable you are, just pushing a little harder on what Arti asked, which is how comfortable are you thinking of patents as an indicator or a proxy for innovation? Because presumably from a politician's point of view, what they want is wealth and jobs, and the theory is basically you invest in this area and the expectation is that economic growth will be faster in the R&D sectors than it would be in other areas. So the question is then, how close is your patenting to an indicator for that phenomenon?
Now you're getting at the fourth paper. If you've noticed, this has all been a discussion where the unit of observation was the city. A much better unit of observation would be the firm. Now that we've coded up all this data on R&D labs, we can now go to data on firms. And we've got their patent data, we have their R&D, we know where their R&D workers are, and we can ask what explains the inventive productivity of firms, not just that productivity, but also their productivity by any conventional measure that you would use, which is your output relative to the inputs that are required, which we can get from financial data. And we can explore those questions more carefully. This also gets at the point you made, which is that these interactions that are going on between firms, you've got to have more disaggregated data to be able to get at this. We've spent a lot of time building up data sets so we can begin to explore these very questions. But that's a paper I could present to you next year. I can't do it now.
Does that get you to this regional advantage, the Route 28 versus Silicon Valley kinds of questions? Can you get at that with data?
Yeah, see, we have a limited, there's a limited amount that we can do, sort of thinking about trade secrecy and the ability of enforcing no-compete clauses at the level of cities or states, because there's not enough variation. What you need is variation within the city and the state, so that you could say, we know there are industries where this movement of know-how is really important, and patents are more or less effective for these firms. And then you are comparing that variation, say, within California and the variation in Massachusetts, or for that matter in Texas, and you can start to do that. But at these more aggregated measures, it's very crude.
Did you have a question on that?
He pretty much covered it.
Oh, great, okay. Stuart.
So I wonder if there's another policy implication here, which involves a different kind of planning, that if you want maximum innovation, as a city, you're better off controlling a wide swath of area and then ensuring there's no development in the outside and pushing all the development to the core in the middle, so that you get the density in the middle. So you just have pasture land on the outside of your community.
Yeah, right. Right.
Right, yeah, and then you have a lot of high rises right
Yeah.
in your core to
Yeah.
create that density.
Yeah, this is what I call the danger of presenting this paper. The first time I ever presented this paper was in Washington at the public policy meetings, and somebody asked exactly that question. In fact, the person was a regional planner and was terrifically excited by this very idea. I have a motivation for a growth restriction, and my response then is going to be the same response now, which is the density of cities is endogenous. The way people locate is a whole bunch of private sector decisions that we need to understand very well before we can think about moving levers around to say that, oh yeah, we actually want more dense areas or less dense areas. And if we don't understand that very well, then we could be asking for trouble. Now, what you could do is say, gee, I wonder if I want to take all of the federal money for highway spending, which is generally spent on new highways, which means further away from cities, and instead maybe I want to put more of that into maintaining old highways and infrastructure in cities. That's an interesting experiment to think about. That might be a way of framing this that I would be more comfortable with, rather than what this person wanted to do, which was to immediately go out and put growth restrictions in every city in the country so that we would invent more.
Yeah, the fellow in the blue shirt. Yeah.
It may be hard to tease out a difference, but if we assume that, as you say, that innovation is produced by higher efficiency of matching, are there any, is there any argument, do you have any data that shows that higher availability of venture capital or seed capital, angel capital, however it may be, in areas where they may have less density can act as a substitute for that lower density? Or it seems the most likely that density will mirror available angel capital or venture capital, but were there any?
I don't think we know the answer to that. I haven't worked with the venture capital data very much, but obviously a lot of it is spent in Silicon Valley and in a few other cities, but I don't think we know very much about the spatial distribution of venture capital. But you could more generally ask, if finance is the constraint, is there data on the availability of credit that is sufficiently disaggregated that would let you figure out whether those constraints bind more in more dense areas or not? And in fact, I work for the central bank. I have some of that data in-house, and I could probably do something like that.
My question is more related to venture capital's role as providing connections, which not only do they provide funds, but they help fill CFO, CIO, whatever.
Yeah.
They help fill those spots, and whether or not that could be an indicator.
Well, the nice way to do that, and there's a bias in this, but if you look at the SEC filings, you're probably going to be able to find the same names, right? And that's how you would track these networking effects. And I think there's actually some people that do this. Ideally, you'd want to go before the SEC filing, before the IPO, and you want to see the networking that goes on there. And that's where you need to get the VC businesses to share some fairly proprietary data. But there are people that work on it. I'm just not as familiar with that data.
Do you have any hypothesis of what you might find? How local is venture capital? That would be one question.
I can think of, I've seen one paper where they're actually saying that these networks only span a few miles, which I think is a remarkable statement. Now, I haven't read the paper thoroughly, so I don't know how good it is, but I mean, imagine if that was true.
Put your money with who you know.
Yeah. But if you sort of think about the way you interact with your colleagues, it really does matter whether the person is down the hall or over on the next campus. It shouldn't, but it really does.
I was wondering, do we have any evidence about the direction of causation in this story? Because one could sort of tell a Stephen Klepper story that it's the firms with the good ideas don't want to move very far away from the parent firm, and so a lot of patents lead to jobs that have a natural tendency toward density.
Right. All right, so something I didn't say in the presentation is we're very concerned about that very question. So when we do our analysis, all of our explanatory variables are deeply lagged. So they're way in the past, and then we're looking at current patent data so that we can make a conjecture about which direction the causation is in. But we also flip the data set around, and we run the regression backwards. And what we find is that, in fact, there is some evidence of reverse causation. It's there. On the other hand, it's more than an order of magnitude smaller. So, in fact, both are going on, but the direction that we're using is much more powerful.
If you cut the data and just look at independent inventors instead of people who sign patents, would you get the same result?
You know, we have cut the data to what we call an independent inventor is an inventor where the patent data does not have an assignee that's a firm. And we have run regressions on that, and I just cannot remember what we found. We did it so long ago. Chatty was very excited about this idea. Gets back at some of these networking questions you guys have asked. And for the life of me, I just don't remember what we found. So I'll go back and look at it.
I mean, in some sense, at its core, what you're trying to do is estimate a production function for patents or knowledge. And clearly, in thinking of it that way, one important input would be R&D dollars.
Yeah.
Right? So just more generally getting outside the VC framework, you'd like to know, you'd like to control for R&D spending in a city and see if when you control for that, are these things important in that production function or not. So maybe this is your fourth paper. If you're looking at it
Actually, it may be the fifth, because the way you get at this is these confidential Census Bureau data sets that actually have R&D at the establishment level, and so we have to get a clearance from the IRS to be able to use this data. But if you can't get that, then you have to do what we did, which is hand code R&D labs. And there's some data which says something about how much R&D they do there or how many PhDs they have, but it's kind of sparse. And as a result, you're going to have crude measures of how big the R&D lab is, but not much more than that. But we do find that it matters.
Did you find any difference with the category of the patent, like the type of invention that it was covering and how important it was for density, factors of the city?
Oh, that's the third paper. So what we do in the third paper is we take an exercise like this and we cut the data set into 17 pieces. So we have 17 industries. And then we run these regressions. And that lets us do one more thing, which is to say, are the spillovers within the industry or from outside the industry but within the city? Okay? And what we find is, first of all, you've got to be looking at an R&D intensive industry, you'll find nothing, which is not really surprising. But if you look at the subset of industries, for example, textiles, you get nothing. But if you look at the R&D intensive industries, then these kinds of effects show up. The coefficients vary quite a bit, and I don't have sort of a compelling explanation about why they vary the way they do, but they are different. And then what you do find is that the spillovers from outside the industry but in the same city are at least as big as the spillovers within the industry, which is different from what most people have found when they do research like this. It's very rare that you would ever think that the spillovers outside are as equally as important as spillovers inside. But that seems to be pretty robust. And as soon as I get it written up, I can start circulating that.
Back there.
Curious to know how the theory or your work squares with maybe European cities, which, like was said, are maybe more dense, maybe have farmland on the outside and dense centers, whereas in America we have maybe more sprawl.
Yeah.
And if we have more patents, how does that?
Well, what would be we've been thinking about doing this on Europe for a while because you also get national variation in contracts and intellectual property and all of these other, and for that matter, labor law, right? The problem is assembling the data. It's really daunting. So we need a co-author from Europe, an economic geographer from Europe, to help us with that. But that's something that we think could be very interesting.
Do you see all this clustering effect in the patents of the patenting effect for all industries that do substantial R&D, or just say civilian industries? What I'm wondering is, in military contractors, if you'd have a different effect because military contractors, because the security restrictions, might not license technology and might not therefore have an incentive to cluster.
Really great question, which I hadn't thought about, but we'll see if we can do it.
Do you have any possible explanations for the reason why it would sort of reach an optimal point and then start to go down as the density increases?
Yeah, the interesting thing about, at least in the theories about how this works, is that the more people you pack into a city, the more expensive the city is to live in. At least your house prices and your rents go up, but usually the cost of all sorts of other services go up. So at some point, adding more people is creating congestion, and that congestion begins working against the efficiency that you're getting from more density. And so it's not uncommon to get a usual story about an optimal city size. Well, as long as land area doesn't change instantaneously, that is, the build-up land area of cities doesn't change instantaneously, then you're going to get the same kind of intuition for the density of cities as well. Just like anything else, you're eventually going to hit the diminishing returns in productivity if you keep throwing more labor and capital at something.
One last question. So another policy implication occurred to me is, have you run the numbers on what were the leading cities, since you have this lag, and things that policymakers would care about, like population growth in those cities, or income growth in those cities, and all the other things that will make this particularly sexy for policymakers?
No, we haven't done that yet. What we did do, though, is we control for growth in the past, because what you could wind up with a story is that a city that has historically been economically dynamic is going to continue to be economically dynamic, and that alone is explaining everything that's going on. And so we control for that. But you're saying, no, let's turn this around. This is an intermediate input. Let's measure something that matters. We have not done that, but there are some other researchers who have. And what they find is that there is a relationship between these kinds of patterns and manufacturing productivity at the state level. And it's pretty significant.
Given that you said that density is endogenous, are there instrumental variable ways of getting at sort of what would be the natural density of a city?
Yep.
So, a city like Boston that started right up against the ocean,
Yep.
only spreads one way,
Yep.
and that might limit its
Yep.
ability to be less dense.
Yep. In the paper, we actually have an instrumental variables approach where we use things like topography, the amount of water in the counties, and weather as instruments for this very reason. And we get almost the same results. But it's a crucial question.
I had another question if no one else does. And this sort of relates back to Jerry's question. I couldn't figure out, pardon me for not getting this immediately, what you were lagging, what you weren't. One of the most important factors in terms of the elasticities was obviously, as one might expect, human capital. And you said, well, relative to that, for example, other types of public expenditures, public R&D expenditures, for example, are less important. But presumably, those expenditures are what attracted human capital in the first instance. So
Yep.
controlling for human capital kind of eliminates the real effect of those
Yep.
expenditures.
Yep.
Okay. So you
yeah. No. If I
take
take the measure of the education of the local workforce out, all the coefficients on local R&D get really big.
Right.
And so then there's obviously a mix. You have talented workers, and then you have the resources you give the workers. And my interpretation of what we find is the most important thing is having talented workers. And then you've got to give them the resources to be productive.
But is it possible that if you give the resources, the talented workers will come?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, that's right. That you get an educated workforce in Raleigh-Durham because people know they can come here and get jobs that are appropriate for their education, and so that is true. When governors and mayors now engage in competition for businesses now, they've sort of moved away from attracting the businesses. They're moving towards attracting the high-quality labor. And how do they do that? They try to convince people that, in fact, there are opportunities to use your skills in these cities, like Philadelphia, for example, that you won't get in other places. And then for example, they'll set up R&D seed funds for startup companies, with the idea of saying, we're actually promoting this.
Which begins to look a little bit like industrial policy.
Well, it does in the sense, well, it's always the question about whether the state is as good at allocating seed money as a venture capitalist is. I would tell you in Pennsylvania, I don't believe the state is any better than a venture capitalist as it. But if the state of Pennsylvania makes it easier for venture capitalists to do their job in Philadelphia, that's going to have an effect. And in fact, we have lots of small drug companies that sort of spin out this way. And the governor understands this, and the mayor understands this. But I don't trust the mayor to hand this money out very efficiently.
Are we done?
Well, I think we're out of time.
Oh, we were out of time, but I'll do one last question for anyone who's still eager to ask. Well, then, I think we should thank our speakers.